Dr. Senge has lectured extensively throughout the world, translating the abstract ideas of systems theory into tools to create economic and organizational change. I now respectfully invite to the stage Dr. Peter Senge to share with us the big dilemma: can an organization learn?
So first off, it's a special pleasure to be back in the country. I get to come here too infrequently. It's probably been 4 or 5 years since I've been in the Emirates, and I'm very, very happy to be back here. Let me just say a few more words about the plan for today, just elaborating what Ahmed just said. I'm going to speak for a little bit at the outset, just to set a context on the background of this work. It'll be fairly brief, a little bit historical, just because it's nice to kind of recognize the threads. Then we'll talk a little bit together, because the real question, the whole point of us being here is, how is this meaningful here? How is this meaningful in your world, in your organization, in your society? The Society for Organization Learning is a global network of communities. And one of the reasons that we thought years ago it was important to start to nurture this network is that the way this work gets done is and should be very different in different cultural settings. By its nature, this work is about people, which means it's always about culture. It's always about the uniqueness and different ways that people approach work in different settings. While we're all part of an increasingly global society, I don't think there's any deeper issue worldwide than how does any society become effective in today's world but not lose its sense of who it is. So this balance between deepening our sense of our own roots and our own uniqueness and simultaneously being effective in a world that's increasingly interconnected is, I think, a universal challenge. I'm coming here today at the end of a 2-week trip, which I make every fall and every spring, to China. So I spend about a month a year and have for about 10 years in China, because personally it's a very important place for me. I'm deeply interested in traditional Chinese culture, but also because obviously China's path in the 21st century will have a huge impact on the path of the world. China, India, I think this part of the world are emerging for all kinds of different reasons as really shaping the future of global development. There is no way that 1.3 billion Chinese will ever live like Americans. It will not happen. What I mean by that is the waste, the material dependence, the extraordinary amount of material that needs to be extracted from the earth to live my lifestyle as an American takes about 1 ton of raw materials extracted from the earth per day. Per day. Now people think that's ridiculous. That's impossible. How could that possibly be true? If you look at the total supply chains, the total value that has to be generated, at the very end of that, about 1% of it becomes a usable product, an automobile, an electronic device, a home, all the embedded capital that we all depend upon. But if you have to look at the whole of that economic system to get a figure like that. No one wakes up in the morning wanting to destroy species. None of us get out of bed and say, oh, it's a good day. I think I'll see if I can do some more damage to the environment. In some sense, all cultures recognize their dependency on nature. However, we are in fact doing exactly that. The destruction of ecosystems around the world is accelerating. We do a lot of work on global fisheries. 2/3 of the world's fisheries are seriously depleted, some unlikely to be restored, certainly not in any short period of time. The world's population depends upon fish protein. And this is kind of a tip of an iceberg, because in part this is happening because of the global destruction of marine ecosystems, both because of local pollution, local overfishing and overexploitation, but also because of what might turn out to be even a more serious consequence of our dependence on fossil fuel, which is the acidification and warming of the oceans, which is destroying coral reefs around the world, which in turn are critical for the reproduction of fisheries. So I'm just using these things to illustrate. There is a pattern of development that has been exported around the world, a set of assumptions and models. In China, you see it with the extraordinary growth of consumerism in the last 10 or 20 years. Everybody thinks that's the future, but in fact, there is no future. It will not happen. Today, the common estimate is we use about 1 1/2 Earths globally in terms of our total resource dependence. If China should ever reach the level of material waste of America, it would be over 2 Earths. India would make 3. We do not have 3 Earths. So clearly, I'm just using this as a kind of a lens. In some ways, it's the easiest lens. The over-dependence on extraction and waste of material, natural resources is one lens. You can also look at the lens of equity. Today, there's over 1 billion people in the world who do not have reliable access to clean drinking water. The World Health Organization says that's going to be about 2 billion by 2020. I use that as a small example of equity. We're very familiar with all sorts of economic measures of poverty, which all ultimately are arbitrary. $1 a day, $2 a day. These are meaningful, but in fact, at some level, what's poverty? You do not have reliable access to clean drinking water. It's an absolute, as opposed to a relative definition of poverty. So the rich get richer, the poor get poorer around the world. It's been the pattern throughout the industrial age. It is, if anything, accelerated in the last decade. So you can look at the social conditions, or you can look at the ecological conditions, and you can draw a similar conclusion. There is a pattern of development that is spreading around the world. It's what we call globalization. It's what we call global industrialization that simply won't continue. Now, many people like to say, well, we left the industrial age is behind us. Not so. This is the industrial age. Believe me, more steel is manufactured in the world today than ever before in history. More automobiles are produced in the world than ever before in history. More fossil fuel energy is consumed today than ever before in history. This is the industrial age. And this notion that the information technology has somehow replaced the industrial age is naive and inaccurate. The thinking of the industrial age is still the thinking of today. And societies around the world, particularly those who have modernized and industrialized in the last 1, 2, 3 decades, really see the conflicts. The industrial age is the machine age. Today we like to use the term technology, but look, it's just machines. Everything that is new, that is exciting, that is modern, is, quote, technology, which is to say, machines. The industrial age is the machine age. It's the age when machines come to dominate more and more of how we live, and machine thinking shapes how we think. There's a term that's been used already today, and I'm going to just use it to illustrate. It's in a sort of sense kind of a neutral term. We tend to use it as a kind of a favorable term, and it's the term human resources. About 20, 30 years ago, businesses around the world began renaming what historically had been called personnel departments as departments of human resources. And generally, this was seen as a kind of enlightened effort to signal the importance of our people, which I couldn't agree with more. However, very few people thought much about what the term actually meant. Human resource. It would have been useful, but no one really did it when this phenomenon, this movement of creating human resource departments was being established, if someone had looked in a dictionary. But of course, no one did. They would have seen, had they, that the term resource means standing in reserve, waiting to be used. Doesn't sound quite as enlightened when you say human, standing in reserve, waiting to be used. I just use this to illustrate the kind of way we think in the modern world. The difference between seeing a forest as a living system and seeing it as timber resources is a big difference. Just as the difference of seeing a human being as a human resource is a big difference. Now, please don't mistake me. I'm not saying we should throw out the term, and I'm not saying the intention and the concerns that sit behind this are not important. They're terribly important. In fact, that's the whole reason I'm bringing this up. I'm just wanting to point out our use of the language and how easy it is for us to use a term like this. Let me give you a couple other examples. I don't know how common this phrase would be here in the Emirates or in the Arab world in general. But in the West, it's very common to talk about leaders who drive change. Is that a term that's familiar here? We need leaders who can drive change. That's interesting. What do you drive? Thank you. It's not a trick question. You drive an automobile, right? Or you drive a tractor. Have you ever tried driving your spouse? How about your teenage son or daughter? What happens if you try to drive your children or drive your spouse? Yeah, it doesn't work too well, does it? We all know that immediately, right? Say, well, yes, I know exactly what it's like. I too have done that. I am raising my hand. You know, I have an agenda sometimes, and I think it'd be great for Diane, da-da-da-da-da. But we all know when one human being tries to drive another human being, usually the outcomes are not particularly terrific. It usually backfires. It usually produces more unintended effects than the intended effect. And yet, notice how comfortably we like this term, leaders who drive change. What I'm trying to illustrate, and I'm just using common linguistic terms, common words, to illustrate, there is a way of thinking that sits behind any age. The industrial age has nurtured a way of thinking, and it shows up most evidently, most obviously in our language. So while the sentiment and the idea, the intent behind using a term like human resources is an absolutely appropriate intent, our people really matter. We don't call them departments of people. We call them departments of human resources. Developing our people is really crucial for our well-being as an organization and society. Absolutely. But then we have a modern system of education, which in my experience around the world, nobody is very happy with. It doesn't really seem to develop people. It seems to focus on technical skills, high level of individual competitiveness. And of course, it's a little different everywhere. Systems of education are different in every country, but there are a lot of commonalities. If you go into a school in Shanghai or Beijing today, it will look very much like a school in New York City or England. The modern industrial age school has spread around the world. Grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, grade 4, grade 5, grade 6. You recognize that? What does it sound like? It sounds like an assembly line, because it was literally modeled after an assembly line. A linear process of improving or producing a product. The product is an educated person, a person who can do math and who can read and who can do all these things. I'll illustrate this in terms of China, because as I said, I spend a lot of time in China. The modern term for education did not exist in China until the 19th century. It was exported into China, as it has been around the world from the West. This modern industrial age system of education, the assembly line education, all based on producing a standardized product, right? Hence, it's always been inseparable from standardized testing. The traditional term in Chinese traditional culture has been almost completely lost. It would be pronounced Jiaowa, which means teaching so as to transform. Teaching so as to transform. How do you help a human being grow and develop as a human being? It's very different than the industrial age system of education, which is not about growing human beings. Almost every traditional system of education in the world, and all societies have them, because all societies have to deal with how we will raise our children. This is a timeless question. So before the industrial Western system of education, there are much older systems of education. And all have to strike a balance between the growth and development of the individual and how that individual understands and appreciates their society, their social context. Education is both individual and collective. It's both personal and social by its nature, if it really is genuine education. I've been involved for the last 5 years with the first school sanctioned by the Communist Party based on traditional Chinese ways of educating a 6 and 7 and 8-year-old 2,000 years ago. And it's fascinating to watch. It also is a modern school, so it has a modern curriculum, so it's a bit of both. The children study Tai Chi. The children study traditional Chinese medicine. The children do calligraphy. And they do what the Chinese call recitation. They recite the classics. They recite Confucius. They recite Mencius. They recite these classic texts, which are really meant to be spoken, that define the core of traditional Chinese culture. Do they understand all that? No, of course not. You talk to a 6 or 7-year-old, they don't necessarily understand the ideas. But they all sing them together, because to recite these classics in the traditional Chinese language, which is a tonal language, if you listen to it immediately, you realize the children are spending 1 to 2 hours a day chanting. And this was understood in traditional Chinese culture as essential for a foundation of social harmony, which would be the classic Confucian term, the foundation of social harmony. So that not only are we growing as a unique individual, but we're growing in relationship to one another. All real systems of education are both individual and collective, personal and social. Again, I'm trying to illustrate a couple of simple points here. I'm going to back up and say what I said at the outset. First off, we are at an extraordinary crossroads. I believe we are in an era already today, not in the future, right now, of profound change. The patterns of development that have characterized the world for the last 100, 200 years will simply not continue. The social stresses, the environmental stresses are growing steadily. No one actually knows today the costs, the economic costs, all aspects of climate destabilization, but they're significant. They are significant. This summer, the month of July, we had a week with 6 million people in greater Washington, D.C. with no power in July. It wasn't a hurricane. It was a storm the likes of which nobody had ever seen before. It had hurricane-strength winds, but it wasn't a hurricane. And it knocked out the power for over 6 million people in greater Washington, D.C. in July. The economic costs of that were very significant. A lot of businesses did not operate. A lot of hospitals had to operate on emergency power. The direct and indirect costs were hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And it's a common event today. The destabilization of weather around the world is causing an extraordinary economic consequence. So whether you look at these kind of environmental conditions or the social ones, the simple point is the past is not going to be the future. Now, I'm not asking you to agree with all this. Obviously, I'm giving a point of view. And if you looked more deeply at the social conditions, as I said, that the deepest issue, I believe, in the world today, particularly evident in countries like the Emirates, in countries like China, in countries like India, that are modernizing very rapidly, do we follow the Western path? How do we become effective in the modern world and yet simultaneously not lose who we are? What's the path that would really be right for us, that would really express our uniqueness, our Islamic heritage, our values, our family commitments, which I know are very, very important in this part of the world? And yet at the same time have an education system that really prepares our children to be effective in the modern world. So when I say the path in the future will not be the path of the past, another way to say that is, how do we find the path for the future? Maybe it will be a little different in different parts of the world. Another feature of global industrialization is homogenization. Cultures look more and more all the same. Again, you see this very vividly in China. Shanghai today and Shanghai 20 years ago, totally different place. Now, of course, you have a couple 100 million middle-class Chinese who all want to drive BMWs and buy Gucci bags, who all see the same advertising that people see around the world, who all go to a Western system of education. Is that really what people want? It's not a question that's asked publicly, but it's a question that's asked privately. And my hope is, by kind of putting this question into the room at the beginning, we give ourselves permission to think about this today. Obviously, the focus today is very much on organizational learning. And you saw the little picture there at the end. That organizational learning, always at one level, is about individual learning. It's about how teams work and how organizations work. And it's always occurring in a social context. It's always occurring in a larger societal context. So by starting out and making these reflections, or sharing these reflections with you about the conditions in the world, I don't mean to suggest that that's what all of today is about. Today is very much about organizational learning. But organizational learning is very different if we assume the future is going to look a lot like the past. Let me just describe this now purely from a business standpoint. There are two roots of the movement for organizational learning, which people like me have been involved with for now quite a few decades. It's getting to be amazing for me to think how long. One has always been this business, as you heard a little while ago, of sustained competitive advantage. In 1982, 30 years ago, Royal Dutch Shell, the parent of all the Shell oil companies worldwide, did a study. Did a study in which they wanted to know first a very simple fact. They thought, well, certainly business school professors must have studied this, but they could find no research. They had one simple question: what's the life expectancy of a large, highly successful Fortune 500 scale business around the world? they found out something which today doesn't surprise people, I don't think, so very much, but it was a big shock in 1982. Looking at the history of the industrial age, the average life expectancy of a Fortune 500 company, doesn't matter if it was in China or if it was in Europe or was in the United States, the most large successful business corporations, the average life expectancy around 30 to 40 years for the last 200 years. Not just recently, but throughout the industrial age. So these really large, successful businesses actually don't last very long. And it's instructive. Today, it's, of course, very easy with the internet. Just go online, take a look at the Fortune 500 in America, which is a set of American largest, most successful businesses, 10 years ago, and you'll see about a third of them no longer exist. 20 years ago, almost two-thirds of them no longer exist. About a third disappears every decade. These are large, powerful, technologically sophisticated enterprises who turn out often to be arrogant, closed, and unable to adapt. They have the answer, and they continue to follow their ideas. That Shell study led to another study. That, by the way, was published within a few years, their finding. A Harvard Business Review article in mid-1980s. Became very well known. And that's where the term organizational learning came from that original article. But there was actually another part of the Shell study which they didn't publish for another 15 years because they thought it was so interesting what they were learning. They kept it quite private. They found, I think it was 18 corporations that were over 200 years old. Leads to a natural question. What's the difference between the organizations that are 200 years old and the vast majority of businesses that don't last very long? They came to a very interesting interpretation. It's not inevitable that businesses fail within 20, 30 years, even the most successful ones within 30 to 40 years. It's not inevitable. It's just common. There's another, much smaller group of businesses which seem to be extremely good at adapting as the world around them changes. That, by the way, was the root of the term organizational learning. They were the first ones. It's nice for me to tell that story because it's kind of honoring our ancestors. That was the first use